The village of Inkaji lay beneath a soft amber dawn wrapped in the kind of stillness that made people believe nothing truly terrible could ever touch this place. Children chased chickens through the dust, women prepared tea over charcoal fires, and the old men exchanged slow, familiar greetings that felt as reliable as the rising sun. It was the kind of morning that whispered safety, quiet, steady, and that was exactly why no one noticed the first sign that something was terribly wrong. A flock of starlings burst from the acacia trees with a violence that didn't match the hour. Their wings cut through the air and a frantic black cloud moving in the direction they never flew at dawn. Old Munzi Luran, who had lived long enough to know when nature was speaking, paused mid-step. His walking stick froze above the ground, and a strange unease called low in his stomach. A shift in the wind, a tremor beneath the earth, something approaching. No one else sensed it yet, and Kaiji was peaceful, always had been. But peace has a strange fragility, like a membrane that can be pierced by a single sound. And that sound came moments later, tearing through the village like a jagged blade. A roar, not the distant regal call that occasionally floated from the Messiah Mar at night. No, this roar was different, closer, ragged, soaked in pain and fury. It vibrated through the air, rattling loose metal roofs, sending goats scattering. The villagers froze, mothers grabbed their children. Young men turned toward the sound with uncertain eyes. And then someone screamed the word no one ever wanted to hear, Simba, a lion, inside the village. The roar came again, louder this time, so loud it shook dust loose from the mud walls. The peaceful rhythm of the morning shattered instantly. Doors slammed, pots crashed, shouts erupted in every direction. Panic rippled through the narrow pathways. But amidst the chaos, one question rose like smoke. Why would a lion enter a village in broad daylight? Lions avoided humans unless something was terribly wrong. That tiny needle of fear pushed through the villagers' hearts, threading anxiety into terror. Every instinct screamed to run, to hide, to pray. Then the lion appeared, limping, bleeding, staggering down the main road. He was immense, easily the size of a small cow, with a dark, thick mane matted by blood. His right paw dragged slightly, leaving a broken trail in the red earth. His ribs expanded with every desperate breath, and his tail lashed the air like a whip of fury. His eyes, normally amber and proud, were wild and focused, filled with the kind of pain that strips an animal of reason. Women gasped and covered their mouths. A child burst into tears. Even the young warriors who rarely flinched at danger stepped back in horror. This wasn't a lion passing through. This was a lion on the edge of madness. The villagers scrambled into their homes, slamming wooden shutters, dragging children under beds. Every instinct screamed that the beast was unpredictable, volatile, one heartbeat away from turning deadly. Dust spiraled behind him with each step, creating a ghostly haze that made the scene surreal, almost unreal. But the most terrifying moment came when he lifted his head and roared directly at the village square. It was a roar of agony, a roar of warning, a roar that didn't belong in a place filled with laughter and morning fires. People trembled behind their doors. Some whispered prayers. Others clutched spears they knew wouldn't matter. The lioness roar rolled across the village like thunder, tearing open the sky. And then came the moment that would haunt every witness for the rest of their lives. Old Thomas Nakuru, 76 years old, frail with a back bent from decades under the equatorial sun, stepped out of his doorway and onto the street. Everyone who saw him froze. For a second, the world seemed to stop breathing. There he was, slender, aging man, with trembling knees, facing a wounded king of the savannah alone, exposed and possibly calm. The distance between them was just 20 paces, far too close, far too dangerous. "Baba Thomas, no," a woman screamed from behind a door, but Thomas didn't flinch. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He simply stood there, eyes fixed on the lion, as if he recognized something the others didn't, as if he'd been expecting this moment. A strange mixture of sorrow and certainty crossed his weathered face. The lion saw him, stopped, stared. In that heavy, suspended silence, the villagers felt something shift, something so profound and incomprehensible. It rooted them in shock. The lion, moments before, roaring in fury, lowered his head slightly, not in submission, not in threat, but in recognition. Gasps spread through the village like wildfire. Hearts bounded, some felt their legs weaken. A bleeding, furious lion had just acknowledged an old man, like someone returning to a memory. It made no sense. It defied everything they knew about wildlife. But the most shocking moment had not yet happened. Slowly, impossibly, the lion took one limping step toward Thomas. And Thomas stepped toward him, barehanded, unprotected, guided by something no one could see. The peaceful village of Inkaji, moments ago, quiet and unremarkable, now watched a scene that would make their blood run cold. A scene that would later spread across the country as a story no one could explain. Because when a wounded predator chooses to approach a human instead of attack, the world holds its breath. And on that terrifying, unforgettable morning, the village learned that danger wasn't the only force capable of breaking a peaceful day. Memory could, too. Thomas Nakuru had always carried his memories like quiet stones in his pockets, heavy enough to feel light enough to ignore if he kept walking. Yet, as he stepped into the path of a wounded lion, those memories rose from the dust of years, drifting through his thoughts with aching clarity. The villager saw only an old man without fear, but inside him, a river of remembrance had begun to stir, pulling him backward to a time no one else in Inkaji even knew existed. Long before age curved his spine and thinned his hands, Thomas had lived a life shaped by silence and wide horizons. Widowed too young, left behind by sons, swallowed by the city, he often moved through his days like a man holding conversations only he could hear. People in the village respected him, even admired his resilience, but they rarely asked about his past. They assumed his solitude was simple preference. They were wrong. His loneliness was not chosen. It was inherited. The years had stripped him gently, piece by piece, until he became a man with more memories than companions. And among those memories once shone brighter than all the rest, an encounter 8 years earlier, buried so carefully beneath the rhythm of ordinary days that even he sometimes doubted it truly happened. It had been the end of the dry season, a time when the savannah cracked underfoot, when every dusk felt like a prayer for rain. Thomas had gone to check his fence line as he did every evening, his machete tapping lightly against his leg. He remembered how still the air was that day, how even the birds had fallen silent. Then he heard it, a faint trembling sound, not a roar, not a growl, something smaller, something terrified. He pushed through a clump of thorn bushes, expecting maybe a trapped goat or an injured antelope. What he found instead stole the breath from his lungs. A young lioness, barely grown her body. A map of fresh wounds lay crumpled in the shade. Blood darkened her golden fur. Cuts tore across her body in cruel parallel lines. Her sides rose and fell in shallow uneven breaths. Her eyes, dim but burning with pain, lifted slowly to meet his. He remembered that gaze with painful clarity. It was not the look of a predator. It was the look of something abandoned, something fighting to exist, something that reminded him painfully of himself. Thomas had known loneliness, He had known what it felt like to lose someone so deeply that the world lost its edges. After his wife died, there were many nights he sat on that same dry earth, wondering if the silence would ever feel less empty. And when his children moved away, first in excitement, then in reluctance, then in silence, he learned a new vocabulary of solitude. So when he saw the dying lioness, the decision came not from reason, but from a place so old and human that logic couldn't reach it. He chose to save her. For 20 days, he became her shadow. He brought water and rusted metal buckets, meat he could barely afford to spare, and words he spoke gently into the dusk. He tended her wounds with hands that shook, not from fear, but from a tenderness he had long forgotten he still possessed. The lioness met him at first with suspicion, then with tolerance, then with a cautious acceptance that grew each day like a fragile seedling pushing through dry soil. By the third week, she stood to greet him. By the fourth, she trusted him with her life, and then when strength returned to her bones, when her wounds closed, when her golden eyes regained their fire, she was gone. Returned to the wild as she was meant to. Thomas never expected to see her again, but he also never forgot her, because she had unknowingly filled a hollow place in his heart, reminding him that his kindness still had weight in the world, that even a man living alone on the edge of the savannah could make a difference to a creature born to roam it. He kept the memory quiet, tender, private. Some stories were not meant to be shared casually. Some stories belonged to the heart, not the tongue. But as he stood in the village road, now face to face with a wounded, enraged male lion, those memories returned with a force that tightened his chest. This was not the lioness. This was someone tied to her, someone she loved, someone she trusted enough to bring to the one human she believed could help. The villagers saw only danger, but Thomas saw the echo of those 20 days, the way her broken body trembled in the shade, the way her eyes softened when she began to understand he meant no harm, the way she learned his voice, his scent, his presence. And now here he was stepping toward her mate with the same slow, cautious calm he once used to approach her. He spoke softly the way he had spoken years ago, not because he believed the lion understood his words, but because he understood the weight of a voice stripped of fear. He could feel the loneliness of his present life blending with the memory of that old bond. His steps were steady, not because he was brave, but because he recognized something painfully familiar in the wounded animal's eyes. Pain, fear, exile, and something else. Something that made his throat tighten unexpectedly. A plea? The lioness' breaths came in harsh, uneven bursts. His massive chest trembled with pain. His eyes, wild only moments earlier, flickered with a strange, trembling uncertainty. He wasn't attacking. He wasn't hunting. He was searching for the one human whose kindness had once rewritten what he believed possible. Thomas approached slowly, remembering the lioness's trust, remembering how she had stood fragile, trembling, yet had allowed him close. He remembered how she had survived because he didn't turn away, and now her mate stood before him, wounded in body and spirit, carrying the weight of a memory no one else in the village even knew existed. Thomas felt a pang of something deep and old, a mixture of grief and gentleness, loneliness and belonging. It settled in his chest like a warm stone. This moment was not about fear, it was about recognition, about the unspoken understanding between two beings who carried scars, one on the skin, one in the heart. And as the villagers watched in horror, Thomas realized something profound. He was not walking toward danger. He was walking toward a promise he didn't know he had made 8 years ago. A promise remembered not by him, but by a lion. The villagers would remember that moment for the rest of their lives, though none of them truly understood what they were looking at. All they saw was an old man standing motionless in the center of the road facing a wounded male lion whose roar shook the dust from the rooftops. But Thomas Naru saw something else, something so quiet, so impossible, that it eclipsed every fear trembling in the air. He saw a message, not spoken, not signaled, but carried in the animal's very presence. The lioness' golden eyes, wild with pain, rimmed with exhaustion, shifted between Thomas and the lioness who stood behind him, and in those fleeting exchanges, those glances so achingly familiar, Thomas felt the past reaching for him like a hand through fog. 8 years collapsed into a single instant. The lioness's recognition earlier had been unmistakable, but this was different. This male wasn't here by accident, nor by rage alone. He was here because she had brought him, and she had brought him because she remembered. The wounded lion limped heavily each step, leaving a dark print of blood on the red earth. His breasts came in ragged bursts, his ribs rising and falling with visible effort. Yet when his gaze settled on Thomas, the chaos in him flickered pain, softening into confusion blending into a strange, searching stillness. It was like watching an animal trying to recognize something beyond the limits of instinct. The lioness made a soft, low sound behind her mate, encouragement perhaps, or reassurance. Her eyes were locked on Thomas in a way that needed no translation. She trusted him, and she was asking her mate to do the same. It was an extraordinary thing to see trust pass from one creature to another like an heirloom. Thomas felt it settle on him with a weight that made his throat tighten. The villagers crowded in doorways whispered in disbelief. "He is mad, his lines be torn apart. Someone pull him away." But Thomas couldn't move. Memory anchored him, and something greater held him there, a sense of responsibility so profound it rooted his feet to the earth. He had saved the lioness once. Now she had returned with a plea woven into the silent air. She had brought her mate to the only human she believed would not harm him, the only one who had shown her mercy in a world that had shown her teeth, and the male understood, even if only in fragments. His roar softened into a deep, trembling growl, not aggression, but fear. The kind of fear Thomas recognized in himself after losing his wife. Fear not of death, but of abandonment, to pain endured alone. The lion took another step forward, and the villagers gasped. But Thomas saw something subtle, a shift in posture, a lowering of the head, a hesitation that would be invisible to anyone who had not spent 20 days kneeling beside a dying lioness, whispering encouragement into the dusk. This male was not challenging him, he was surrendering, not in weakness, but in recognition. Thomas crouched slowly, speaking the words he had spoken years ago, as if the wine would carry them across whatever thread tied their lives together. Pull, pull. Slowly, slowly, you re safe here, the lioness responded before the male did. She stepped to the wounded lioness' side, pressing her flank lightly against his, grounding him with her touch. And then she did something extraordinary, something that made Thomas's hands tremble. She nudged her head toward Thomas, inviting the male to trust him. The lioness' breath itched, his muscles tense, not with the readiness to attack, but with the agony of deciding whether to obey instinct or memory borrowed from another. His eyes flickered golden flames, dimming, then brightening again. Thomas saw the moment the lion made his choice. He lowered his massive head, not fully, just enough to break the invisible barrier between fear and acceptance. Just enough to say, "I will let you try." Thomas felt a rush of emotion so intense it nearly stole his breath. It wasn't triumph or bravery or relief. It was something ancient, primal, and humbling. The realization that a creature capable of killing him in an instant was placing its life in his hands simply because it trusted the memory of a lioness he once saved. He rose slowly and walked back toward his home, the lioness watching every step, ensuring he understood the fragility of the moment. When he returned with water and claws, the male did not lunge, did not retreat. He simply watched, trembling as Thomas knelt in front of him. Up close, the wound was worse than he imagined. A deep, brutal gash carved along the lioness' paw, swelling rapidly, bone nearly visible beneath torn flesh. The smell of blood was sharp and heavy in the warm afternoon air. Thomas dipped a cloth into the bucket, wrung it out with shaking hands, and spoke softly, I know it hurts, but you're not alone." The lioness' entire body shivered, his jaws clenched, his claws flexed against the earth, but he held still. Thomas reached forward, and the lion allowed him to touch the wound. A sound rippled through the village, half gasp, half disbelief, half prayer. The lioness remained posed beside them, her eyes wide, her breath steady, as if she were guiding the moment with her own heartbeat. Thomas worked with the slow precision of a man handling something sacred. Every time the lion flinched, the lioness nudged him softly, anchoring him again. And as Thomas cleaned the wound, he realized the message the male had brought was not simply a cry for help, it was a testament. A lioness had remembered a kindness across years, distance, and seasons, and she had carried that memory home. Perhaps the male didn't fully understand the story behind her trust, but he understood her loyalty, and that was enough to bring him here, limping across dangerous terrain into a village of terrified humans for the one man she believed could save him. It was not instinct. It was not accident, it was choice, and as Thomas wrapped the wound with trembling hands, the male lion looked directly into his eyes, not with dominance, not with threat, but with a depth that made Thomas's breath catch. Recognition, a message without words. I remember what you did for her, and because of that, I am here. In that moment, Thomas understood something he had never dared to believe. Kindness does not vanish. It circles back, sometimes years later, sometimes in the form of a wounded lion who walks into a village not to destroy, but to seek the one human whose compassion changed the course of his mate's life. It was a bond no one else could see, a bond stronger than fear, a bond that had returned to him today, roaring, bleeding, limping, carrying a message written not in language but in trust. The air in the village felt carved from tension itself, as if every breath taken by the onlookers trembled under the weight of the moment unfolding before them. Thomas Nakuru remained kneeling beside the massive wounded lion, the bucket of water at his feet, his hands shaking with age and fear and something deeper, responsibility. Despite everything he had lived through, never had he imagined he would one day face a wounded apex predator with nothing but cloth courage and the faint hope that trust, fragile, borrowed, and remembered, would be enough to save both of their lives. The male lioness breathing had grown heavier, turning into a low, vibrating rumble that rolled through his rib cage. Each breath carried pain like a pulse, his injured paw twitched uncontrollably, muscles contracting from shock. Blood seeped through the makeshift wrapping Thomas had dared to place earlier, darkening the cloth with alarming speed. This lion was not just hurt, he was losing his fight with consciousness, and a lion in that state was the most dangerous kind of creature, irrational, unpredictable, trapped between instinct and desperation. But beside him, the lioness remained firm, posed like an anchor in the storm. Her golden eyes followed Thomas's every movement, reading intent with remarkable intelligence. When the male growled sharply, She touched her muzzle to his jawline, a calming gesture Thomas recognized from watching lions in the reserve, the comfort, reassurance, the promise that he was not alone. The villagers still watched from afar, unable to tear themselves away, mothers clutching their children, young men ripping tools they couldn't bring themselves to use, elders whispering prayers and trembling voices. Their fear was a living thing that hovered above the dirt road like a dust cloud, but none of them dared come closer. Only Thomas stood inside the circle where human and predator shared the same breath. The male suddenly tried to stand. The movement was violent, an explosion of muscle and instinct. His claws tore into the ground, sending dirt flying. His roar cracked through the air like thunder vibrating inside Thomas's bones. The old man stumbled back on reflex, arms raised as if he could shield himself from a 250 kilograms force of fury and agony. The lioness jumped in front of the male, blocking him not from attacking Thomas, but from collapsing under his own weight. Her body pressed against his, steadying him. "Easy," Thomas whispered through the words came out unsteady and to soft, pull. Slowly, the male's eyes snapped to him, burning with fear more than aggression. Thomas recognized it instantly. He had seen it in animals and people, even in himself the day he buried his wife. It was the fear of losing control, of succumbing to pain, of not knowing whether the next moment would be your last. Thomas lowered himself again, refusing to retreat. "I am here to help," he murmured, voice trembling but unwavering, "just like I helped her." The lioness made a gentle rumbling sound. Not a roar, not a warning, almost a purr, a signal, a bridge, and slowly, as if remembering the unspoken agreement between them, the male lowered his massive body back to the ground, not fully trusting, but no longer resisting, a choice, a miracle. Thomas exhaled shakily, wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, and forced himself to focus. The wound was deep, infection was already setting in. The lion needed more than water, he needed pressure cleaning in time. But time was a luxury the three of them did not have. The villagers' fear was shifting from paralysis into agitation. Thomas could hear murmurs behind him. "He is going to get himself killed. We need to scare the lion away. What if the other lions come? Where are the rangers?" Questions sharpened the air like knives. Thomas ignored them. If anyone rushed in now, if anyone threw a stone, shouted too loudly, or made a sudden movement, the fragile thread holding this moment together would snap violently. The male lion growled again, and Thomas reached toward the wound. The sound was deep, primal, a reminder of the razor-thin line between acceptance and fatal reflex. But the lioness stepped closer, so close Thomas could feel the warmth radiating from her flank. She nudged the male's injured shoulder gently, telling him it was all right, telling him to trust. And then Thomas did something no one watching would ever forget. He placed his hand directly on the male lion's head, not hard, not forceful, just a steady open palm resting on the animal's mane, grounding him, asking for permission. The lion froze, his nostrils flared, his breath hitched. Then, miraculously, he let out a long, trembling exhale and lowered his head to the ground, an offering of trust. Thomas felt tears burn behind his eyes. "It's all right," he whispered, brushing the man with the reverence of a man touching something sacred. "I've got you. I won't let you die here." With the lioness watching protectively, Thomas cleaned the wound again, pressing gently to slow the bleeding. The lion winced, muscles spasming in pain. His roar was muffled this time, more breath than sound, but the entire village still felt it vibrating through their ribs. The lioness responded instantly, pressing her forehead to his breathing with him in synchronization, calming him with a bond so deep it felt older than language. Thomas watched the interaction humbled. There were battles humans could never fight alone: grief, pain, fear. Lions fought them too, and they fought them together. Thomas secured a second layer of cloth, binding it tightly. It wouldn't last long, but it would buy them time until help arrived, if help arrived. The lioness stepped forward, suddenly brushing her flank against the old man's shoulder. Her touch was gentle, deliberate, and so unexpected that Thomas closed his eyes for a moment to steady himself. He felt her breath near his face, the warm wild air of an animal who had crossed years and distance, and the gulf between species, to come back to the only human who had ever saved her. But now she was asking for more. Not just help, not just care. She was asking him to trust them too, to believe that just as he had risked his life for her, once they would allow him to risk it again. Thunder rumbled far across the savannah. The afternoon light shifted, turning the horizon amber and gold. Somewhere in that glowing wilderness, rangers were racing toward the village. But no one watching this scene doubted what force had truly kept disaster at bay. Not weapons, not fences, not fear, but a quiet, defiant thread of trust stretched between an old man, a wounded lion, and a lioness who had carried a memory across 8 long years. And in that fragile circle drawn in dust and blood, Thomas realized the truth. They weren't battling each other. They were battling fear itself, battling death, battling the boundary between species, and for the first time they were winning. The lioness' breathing had steadied by the time the last rays of sunlight spilled across the village, painting the dirt road with a warm amber glow. Thomas Nakuru remained kneeling in the dust, his hands trembling from exhaustion, from age, and from the overwhelming reality of what he had just lived through. The air felt strangely quiet now, as if the world itself had stopped to witness a moment too sacred to disturb. The lioness stayed close to her injured mate, her body curved protectively around him, but her eyes never left Thomas, not with fear, not with suspicion, but with a calm, anchored recognition that struck deeper than words could ever reach. It was the same gaze she had given him 8 years ago, when she was broken and bleeding and the world had turned its back on her. It was the gaze of a creature remembered, truly remembered, who had stood between her and death. And today she had returned that gift. The villagers remained at a distance, no longer shouting, no longer panicking. They stood in a silent crescent, watching with a mixture of awe, disbelief, and something much more fragile, respect. Some had tears on their faces without realizing it. For all their fear, for all their warnings, they were witnessing something they would tell their grandchildren one day, that an old man forgotten by the world had bridged a gap that no one believed could be crossed. Thomas rose slowly, every movement pulled from muscle stiffened by strain and fear. He didn't rush, he didn't turn his back abruptly. He simply stood, dusted his palms on his trousers, and exhaled softly. "You're going to be all right now," he said gently, the words more breath than sound. "The rangers will take care of the rest." He wasn't sure if the lions understood his voice, but they understood his tone. There was no urgency in his steps as he backed away. Only gratitude, only humility for being allowed so close to something ancient, wild, and infinitely powerful. The male lifted his head just slightly and looked at Thomas through half-lidded eyes. Pain still clouded his gaze, but behind it was something clearer, something intentional, something that made Thomas stop breathing for a heartbeat. Recognition, not the same way humans recognize faces, not with names or memories or years, but with instinct, with some deep-rooted awareness that had survived wounds, droughts, migrations, and the brutality of the wild. The lion saw him, not as prey, not as threat, not even as outsider, but as the human the lioness had once trusted with her life. The lioness rose first, nudging her mate softly, encouraging him to try. He staggered his injured paw, trembling, but he managed to stand with a slow, dignified ascent. His breath was ragged, but there was strength in the way he pressed closer to her flank. She steadied him with her shoulder, guiding him with a tenderness so profound that even the villagers fell silent in reverence. Thomas felt his throat tighten. Creatures this feared, this powerful, this untamable, yet capable of devotion that could humble a human heart. They began to walk slowly. At first, each movement deliberate, purposeful. The lioness glanced back once, a final check, a final acknowledgement, and for a brief second her gaze locked with Thomas's again. But this time the look held something different. Not desperation, not pain, a message, a thank you, not spoken, not expressed in any gesture the human world could codify, but unmistakable. Thomas felt his eyes burn. He blinked the tears away quickly, partly from emotion, partly from the instinctive knowledge that he was witnessing something rare and unrepeatable. The lions did not run. They did not disappear into the tall grass like ghosts from another world. They moved with slow, regal certainty, the kind that came from trusting the land, trusting each other, trusting the path ahead, even when it was steep and shadowed. The setting sun gilded their backs as they crossed the boundary where village dust met wild savanna, leaving behind footprints that the wind would erase. But the villagers never would. As they reached the edge of the acacia groves, the injured lion paused just long enough to turn his head one last time, just long enough for Thomas to see those golden eyes once more softening in the dimming light. It wasn't a roar, it wasn't a threat, it wasn't even a farewell. It was acknowledgement, respect, gratitude drawn in silence. Then he followed the lioness into the wilderness, their silhouettes slowly blending with the grasses to shadows merging into the vast tapestry of the Mara. And in that fading view, Thomas felt something settle inside him, a quiet, powerful truth he had learned only through years' loss, kindness, and today as impossible miracle. Some bonds don't need language, some loyalty doesn't fade with time, some gratitude outlives fear itself. When the lions were finally gone, the villagers approached Thomas with hesitant steps as if he were now part of a different world. Some placed gentle hands on his shoulder, some whispered prayers. Others simply stared at him with a reverence he had never known in all his 74 years. "How are you still alive?" someone murmured shakily. Thomas smiled softly, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the lions had vanished. "Because kindness," he replied, "is never truly forgotten." For the first time, the village understood what he meant, not because he said it, but because they had seen the proof walk away on for powerful legs, leaving a trail of awe in its wake. Thomas turned toward his small home. His steps were slow, but his heart felt impossibly light, as if some long-lost part of him had been returned. The villagers followed quietly, some offering tea, others offering help, but Thomas needed nothing in that moment. He had received the rarest thank you the world could offer, a goodbye that wasn't an ending at all, but a promise that kindness echoes even across 8 years, even across species, even across the wild. In the quiet that followed the lioness' departure, the village of Nomau finally exhaled. But the breath everyone released was not the breath of relief alone. It was something deeper, something ancient, something human. Because what they had witnessed that afternoon was not just an encounter between a wounded predator and an elderly farmer. It was a moment that stripped away everything people thought they knew about fear, about instinct, about the divide between humans and the wild. It was proof that sometimes the strongest language isn't spoken. It is remembered Thomas Nehru did not save the land by force or bravery or physical strength. He saved him with something far rarer, a kindness given 8 years earlier during a time when no one was watching and no one expected anything in return. A kindness that asked for nothing, shouted to no audience, and carried no promise of reward. And yet nature remembered that lioness carried the memory across seasons, migrations, droughts, and storms. She remembered the hands that had tended her wounds, the voice that had soothed her when she believed she would die alone. She remembered not with logic, but with something deeper, the same instinct that allows animals to navigate thousands of miles, recognize their young in chaos, and choose trust against all odds. Her return was not coincidence, it was a declaration. Kindness echoes, compassion binds, and gratitude can survive in places we least expect. When the wounded male lion lay in the dust, too weak to defend himself, too wild to understand human intentions, what he saw before him was an old man who should have been afraid, but wasn't. He saw a man who approached without a weapon, without dominance, without any claim to power except the courage to step forward when everyone else stepped back. Thomas never planned to be a hero. He simply lived by a truth the modern world often forgets, that doing the right thing even when no one is looking matters, that compassion doesn't need proof to be real, that the heart remembers what the world forgets, and the lions proved it today. His story reminds us that courage is not always loud. Sometimes it is a quiet old man walking toward danger because he refuses to let fear decide who he is. Sometimes courage is offering help to a creature who cannot thank you, only to learn years later that gratitude finds its way home. This moment in the Mall village also challenges something bigger in all of us. The idea that the world is divided between us and them, that humans stand on one side and animals on the other. But when the lioness stepped between Thomas and the wounded male, guiding him with her body language, protecting him with her presence, something extraordinary happened. For a moment, species didn't matter, only trust did. And trust, real trust, is earned through compassion, not fear. The villagers who once screamed for Thomas to run now speak of him with reverence. They tell the story not as a miracle, not as luck, but as a lesson in what humans can be at their best: gentle, brave, consistent, and willing to see life as something worth protecting, no matter the form it takes. And maybe that is the greatest lesson of all, that kindness is never wasted, that the heart has a longer memory than the mind, and that even across the vast wilderness of the Mara, gratitude can return in the shape of a lion. If this story touched you, if it reminded you that compassion still matters, if it made you believe even for a moment in the quiet miracles that happen when humans and animals meet in respect, then please subscribe to the channel. Your support gives us the strength and motivation to continue bringing powerful, emotional, and inspiring stories just like this one. Stories that remind us of the beauty in our world, the bonds we often overlook, and the kindness we are all capable of. Subscribe today so you never miss the next unforgettable story. Thank you for being here.